It probably goes without saying that there were a lot, and I mean a lot, of different aircraft manufactured during World War II, many of which entered service. But if you ask someone to name off a few, there are plenty you hear. Spitfire, Mustang, Focke-Wulf 190, Bf 109, but there's some more obscure aircraft that you don't hear about. And honestly, I probably shouldn't even say obscure, as some of these were made in pretty high numbers. They just don't get brought up that often, and not even really because they were bad. Just as they fell by the wayside, they didn't become as famous as some other aircraft did. So I decided to put these guys in the spotlight, as I feel like they deserve it too. I only gave myself 2 rules for this list, which was A, you don't hear about these planes very much, and B, they had to have actually entered service. Because it's not really a surprise to anybody that a one-off experimental aircraft might be a bit obscure. Duh. But no, all of these were actually utilized and manufactured in full production during World War II. They still, however, fell a bit by the wayside, historically speaking. The CAC Boomerang. The heck is a boomerang? Well, I mean, we know what a boomerang is. What does that mean in terms of an airplane? Well, admittedly, I put it low on the list in terms of aircraft that don't get talked about nearly enough, because I guarantee all my Australian fans are probably in the comments right now being like, hey, why are you saying our plane's obscure? How dare you? But, guys, I'm not trying to throw shade here. On the contrary, I'm trying to give it the credit it's due. I'm just saying that if you're not from Australia, even if you're into World War II history, you may not be very familiar with this particular plane. But, as you may have already deduced, this is a fighter aircraft that was designed and manufactured in Australia by the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation between 1942 and 1945. The origins of the airplane date back to the 30s, when it was quite noticed that Germany and Japan were getting a little excitable, to say the least. And in Australia, their domestic aircraft industry would require substantial expansion and reorganization in order to produce a modern combat aircraft in sufficient numbers. When the war started, early on, Australia got a lot of fighters from Britain, but as things got more hectic, British manufacturing capacity was hard-pressed to even supply themselves, let alone Australia. And as far as us in America, well, we had plenty of manufacturing capacity, but a lot of that was being monopolized by, well, again, ourselves. So Australia felt the need to actually produce their own plane and not depend on their allies for hardware, and thus resulted in the Boomerang. Only 250 of the plane were built in several different variants, and that was because, while they were a perfectly acceptable fighter, they definitely had some weaknesses when compared to a lot of other aircraft. They were designed with an emphasis on high maneuverability, and that was achieved fairly well. The problem was engine availability. They didn't have access to the best possible engines, which resulted in the Boomerang being slower than a lot of contemporary fighter aircraft. But, again, they were pretty maneuverable. But because of the speed limitation, the Boomerang very, very, very rarely engaged in actual aerial combat. Early in the war, they were used to equip home-based operations, and as the war pushed forward, they were pressed into ground support roles, which they did pretty well, actually. They also did aerial reconnaissance as well as air-sea rescue, so Australia did get some sufficient use out of their Boomerang despite the limitations they were forced to work with. I've actually conversed with a few Australian World War II history buffs who were quite proud of their Boomerang, so it seems that regardless of their speed performance, they still get much love from the land down under, and justly so. There are quite a number still in preservation as well. The Fiat G55 Centauro. This sharp-looking plane is Italian in origin. It was a single-seat World War II fighter aircraft, introduced by Italy in 1943. They only ever got to produce about 349 of them in total, and 75 of those were post-war. They didn't get much of a chance to really shine, as they should have fairly late in the war, but when they did, well, frankly, Italian fighter pilots loved them. when they used this plane to clash with other top-tier fighters of the era like the Spitfire, the Mustang, Thunderbolts, Lightning, the Centauro could hold its own. They were good, genuinely so, but again, they never produced enough of them for it to really matter in the grand scheme of things. And even the Luftwaffe, after comparative tests between the 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, and the Centauro, had to admit that the G55 was the best Axis fighter. So, there's that. The Grumman F8F Bearcat. Some may question my decision to even put this on the list because over 1,000 of these aircraft were produced, and... wait, cat. You mean like Wildcat and Hellcat? And yes, Bearcat was yet another evolution of that particular family of aircraft. Development on it didn't start until late 1943, and it wasn't actually introduced until May of 1945. Given the war would end in a few months from there, you can kind of see why the Bearcat just never really got a chance to shine. And the concept for the Bearcat dates back to a meeting between Grumman and veteran F4F Wildcat pilots who flew during the Battle of Midway. At that meeting, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch pointed out that one of the most important requirements in a good fighter plane was climb rate, which the Wildcats weren't necessarily great at when compared to enemy fighters. Grumman realized they would have to enhance the plane's power-to-weight ratio. In addition to improving the Wildcat, they were also looking to improve the Hellcat. The Hellcat was already really good, but it couldn't operate from escort carriers like the Wildcat could, because the Hellcats were too large and heavy. So they had to increase power-to-weight ratio and make the aircraft small enough to operate on escort carriers. Okay, good. That's great. But they definitely pulled it off. The Bearcat is widely considered to be the best version of this particular family of aircraft, and it was Grumman's last piston-engine fighter. Modified versions of it in the modern day have actually broken speed records for piston-engine aircraft, and it's still popular among warbird owners and air racers. It just never really got to do much during the war because it showed up so late. Post-war, the Bearcat was utilized heavily by the Navy in terms of equipping squadrons with a new modern plane, but then jets started showing up. But the Bearcat did meet its design goals, and in some ways exceeded them, and for that, I think they deserve a lot more love. The Hawker Tempest. This British aircraft was developed from the Hawker Typhoon, and it was primarily used by the Royal Air Force during World War II, but it wasn't introduced till January of 1944, which, again, you're probably noticing is a little late to the party. The intention of the Tempest was to create an improved derivative of the Typhoon, directly addressing one of the Typhoon's rather unexpected issues. Over time, its performance at high altitude was getting way worse. It just couldn't cut it. So they decided to replace its wing with a thinner, laminar flow design. The end results did differ quite a bit from the Typhoon, which is why it was renamed to the admittedly very cool Tempest. And it was one of the most powerful fighters of World War II, and at low altitude, it was the fastest single-engine propeller-driven aircraft of the war, period. When it was introduced, it was used to intercept V-1 flying bombs, as well as in ground attack roles. It was also effective as an interceptor, low level, even against jets like the Me-262. And Britain wound up building 1,702 of them, but they're often overshadowed by other British planes that were a lot more prevalent, like the Spitfire and all its many, many variants, as well as the Mosquito. The Tempest just showed up late, and didn't have as much of a chance to be noticed like the other two did. The A-20 Havoc, sometimes known as the DB-7, or the Boston, or the P-70. Depends who you ask and what variant you're talking about. Manufactured by the Douglas Aircraft Company and first flying in 1939, it's, well, the opinion of the United States Army Air Forces was rather mid when it came to this plane. They really weren't that interested in it. Despite this, the French actually wound up being very interested in the aircraft. They placed an order for 100 of them on February 15th, 1939, and upped that order to 170 in October. As a result of that, a major redesign was carried out, giving it a deeper but narrower fuselage, which could accommodate a crew of 3, the pilot, the bombardier, and a gunner. These changes did get the Army Air Corps' attention, and they decided that it could be utilized for an attack bomber. The British also wound up flying some, and their pilots summed it up as, well, it has no vices and is very easy to take off and land. The plane was extremely forgiving and easy to fly. Former pilots actually considered it their favorite aircraft of the war, because while it was technically a bomber, it was small enough to be maneuvered and thrown around like a fighter if they really had to. But it also put it in a really weird space where it wasn't really great at being a fighter, but not really great at being a bomber. It just did kind of both those things fine while being really fun to fly. And while that meant it was only kind of ever average at everything it did, it also made it extremely flexible. The things found a role in every single combat theater of the war, and was considered a pilot's airplane because of how easy it was to fly. They were produced all the way till 1944, and they built 7,478 of the things. An insane amount of this plane were built, and yet you just don't see it brought up very much. Probably because it was just kind of a really weird plane. It did a little bit of everything, but never exceeded in anything. A true jack-of-all-trades, master of none kind of deal here. But pilots loved them, and secretly, frankly, they're kind of one of my favorites. And I can dig the easygoing nature of them, as well as the I'll just do a little bit of everything, hope that's cool attitude here, you know? And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Anzac A1 Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Row Videos, Lord Off 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Acer for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, Ennis Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Perez Drenton, Bradley Bowden, Dr. Racer 78, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, and Travis Stolinsky. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual of fun, farewell.